This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host, Eran Halperin. Every week we bring you conversations with authors about the books and research and other things that we like. And if you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage, that's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll down to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon. Click and support us. Some of you have been doing this for months and years, and we simply cannot thank you enough. This is an episode in an ongoing series co-sponsored by the Sadie and Ludwig Kahn Chair in Jewish History at UCLA, and I'm delighted to be joined again by my brother-in-arms, Professor David Myers, who holds the Kahn Chair. Professor Myers is a distinguished professor of Jewish history, as well as the director of the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. Hi, David. Good to have you back.
Hi, Gilad. Great to be here.
Our guest today is a professor of psychology at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, specializing in social and political psychology. He's the head and founder of aChord at the Hebrew University. It's a leading research center dedicated to promoting social change in the Israeli society through the tools of social psychology. He has published extensively on emotions and intergroup conflict, most recently in his latest book, Warning, Hate Ahead, that has just been published in Hebrew. Professor Eran Halperin, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hi, Gilad. Hi, David. Thank you for inviting me. It's great to be here.
Well, it's great to have you. And let's, in a sense, begin at the beginning. So throughout your career, starting with your PhD dissertation, you've focused your research on one emotion, one phenomenon in particular, and that is hate. So can you tell us why hate is so important? And in what ways is it different or more dangerous than other negative emotions, such as contempt, anger, or humiliation?
Yeah, well, I think that even before I'll start talking about hate, I want to say that, I believe that at the end of the day, emotions drive people. And they drive, individual attitudes, individual behavior, motivations. We have many things, many psychological constructs that we consider like values, like ideologies, like perceptions. But at the end of the day, these are our emotions that drive our behavior. And this is true for individuals, but it's also true for groups and collectives. So, I usually say I like all emotions. I don't study only hate. We study in our lab, emotions like fear, like humiliation, like anger, and also positive emotions like empathy or hope. But I think that when I look at societies, and especially at societies in conflict, then hate, stands up as probably the most influential and definitely the most destructive emotion. And when we try to understand why, what's so different about hate when compared to other emotions, so it's important to understand that it's not just that hate is considered the most extreme emotion. When you want to say about something, or you want to communicate to people that something, you have the most negative feelings about something, you say, I hate it. My kids say, I don't know, I hate eggplants, okay, or I hate whatever. But that's not really what we mean, or what I mean when we study hate, or when we think about hate in the intergroup domain or in the collective context. When I think about hate, and the story of hate is different from the story of other emotions, because when people hate, they appraise or think very, very negative things, or attribute very, very negative things to the innate characteristic of a person or of a group. So, for example, I can say, Gilad, you made me really, really angry because, I don't know, you were late this morning. Not that you were late, but you made me angry. But you made me angry because you did something wrong. Your behavior was wrong. I perceived it as wrong, or as unfair, or you shouldn't behave this way. But it's not as if I'm saying, Gilad, you are wrong, or you're a bad person, or you're there's something negative about yourself. So when we're angry at a particular behavior or statement or attitude of a person. When people hate something, when they hate a person or a group, they basically say this person or group, they're innately bad, they're innately evil, they're innately immoral or racist or violent or whatever. So it means that, the emotion is not targeted at a specific behavior of the person, but instead it is targeted at the person itself. Or when we're talking about groups, so it means that it is targeted to the group itself. So the group, there's something about their culture or their genes or their history, or, they are innately evil, innately bad. And then
Does that make it more effective in that sense, in spurring people into action, and therefore also less prone to change?
Okay, so these are two very different questions.
Mhm.
So first of all, it's definitely less prone to change because it means that, you're not talking about, if you made me angry because of a particular behavior, then you can do something to fix it, or I'll forget, and then I won't be angry anymore. But if I think that you are evil by nature, okay, that's the way you are, you will never change, then it doesn't, if tomorrow morning you won't be late, or you will be late, or you'll do something bad to me, then it won't change the emotion. The emotion is much more stable and much more deep in a way than other emotions, because it reflects a much deeper understanding or perceptions of me about your nature, your culture, who you are, more basically. I'm not sure that it would move you or motivate you more quickly to action. And I'm being very cautious about the answer to this question because, hate is so destructive, because if I believe that you are innately evil or bad as a person or as a group, then what does it mean in terms of what I want to do right now? The whole idea about emotions is that an emotion is like, it's like a gestalt of components that, it starts by a very meaningful event in the reality, then some appraisal or interpretation of the event, then the affective, the emotional thing in me, which motivates me for action. If someone is threatening me, so, I appraise the situation as, he's trying to hurt me, I cannot protect myself, I feel like I have to do something, and then this fight or flight mechanism that motivates me to do something. In hatred, the motivation is a little bit tricky, because if I perceive you as someone who wants to hurt me or even destroy me as a group or as a nation, and then I say, but it's not just now, it's not just because I did something wrong right now, it's because that's the way you are, that's who you are, that's in your culture, then what would be the motivation? What exactly do you want to do about it? The motivation must be, almost automatically, very, very, very extreme. And all of this was in order for me to say that I think that hatred very often doesn't really translate to the action. Because it's very difficult, it's not non-normative, it's illegal, and in that sense it's very different from other emotions. But when it does, then the translation of hatred into the motivation for action can cause huge negative circumstances to the world.
Is hate really always destructive? Because on the other hand, it has the potential to galvanize a collective against a common enemy. It can have positive effects as well.
Yeah, definitely. So I would say, most emotion researchers would say that, all emotions have functions. So there's a reason why we as human beings experience emotions. It's the easiest explanation would be about fear. If there weren't any fear if there wasn't any fear in the world, we were bumped by cars every day. You need to feel fear in order for you to adapt to the environment. And I think that, again, I'm saying it because I want to say that even the most terrible emotions like hatred, they have a function. And you're absolutely right. And we know that hate helps societies, to come together. It helps societies, to develop this positive self-image. And developing positive self-image is really important for societies for two reasons. One is to function, like to to operate together, to create these shared narratives, and to cooperate or collaborate. And the second thing is that one of the reasons why we have groups or why we have societies is that societies help the individuals within them to feel good about themselves. And in order for these individuals to gain this positive self-image from their group, they need to feel that their group is, moral, competent, whatever you want to feel about your group. And the only way, the most classic theory in social psychology of intergroup relations is social identity theory of Tashfel and Turner. And they talked about the fact that, the only way that groups can help individuals to gain this positive self-image, driven by their affiliation with the group, is by intergroup comparisons. And so in order for me to feel that my group is very moral, I have to believe that it's much, much more moral than other groups. And this is not, it's not yet hatred, but it's very close to hatred. So hate does have a function. I think that it's always important to say, that there are ways, or I would say more constructive ways, to create group cohesiveness and even group differentiation without getting to the point of hating the other group.
So this is a very interesting lead to follow. And just in a certain sense, I want to go back to the question of ideology and get your sense. You began to allude to it in your last answer. How does hate take rise? In other words, what needs to be present? It sounds like in almost every instance, you need an other to be present in order for it to take rise. But what other ingredients converge to make that emotion hate rather than fleeting anger, something that's more episodic? What are the ingredients that need to be around?
That's a great question. So I would say that there are different approaches to that, and the most radical approach, I would say, would basically say you don't need anything. Like, if you go back to the studies, the late 70s studies of Tashfel and Turner, they would say, take any group of people, split them into two groups, call them, I don't know, greens and reds, like whatever you want to call them. And very, very quickly, they will develop, positive self-image to their own group and hate towards the other group. But I don't think that that's the most accurate answer I want to give you. But it should be said, and that's an important point, that even before you have, these real or realistic like threats or competition or conflict or repeated, damage that one group caused to the other, the very, very basic processes would lead people to at least some intergroup hostility in order for them to preserve their group positive self-image and cohesion. So even before we take it like in a way to the real world, hate can be developed only by the fact that, we have our own group. We want to keep it together. We want to create our own narrative. We want to differentiate it from all other people that are not part of our group, and then hate can be created. But if I do think about it, outside of the lab in the real world, so the most basic thing that should happen or that needs to be happen in order for hate to be developed is that one group perceive, or people within a group perceive, that the other group is repeatedly hurting them, and that the other group is repeatedly hurting them, or trying to hurt them, or trying to hurt people that they care about, or values that they care about. And they do it, enough. I mean, the repetition is long enough for them to say that what they do is not due to specific circumstances or situation, not because of instrumental, considerations, because they want to gain something. They do it because, that's the way they are. So it's a combination of, of fear, of anger, of, feeling that they want to hurt me, they're treating me unfairly, I shouldn't be treated this way, but also, the fact that I believe that they did it enough times for me to realize that This is who they are. That's the way they are. They will never, never change their behavior. Gilad said it at the beginning, maybe hate is less malleable, less changeable. And I think that's part of the point. You get to the point in which you're saying, it's not accidental. It didn't just happen right now. That's the way they are. And if that's the way they are, how can we address that?
So from the perspective of the hater, hate is rational. It makes sense given the way one positions oneself vis-a-vis the other. I'm wondering if from the perspective of the social psychologist, hate is rational. How does it look to you and your colleagues? As the height of irrationality, as a completely understandable, rational sentiment within the system, or some combination of the two?
Okay, so again, I'll take one step backwards when you're asking the question. I'm really, I'm repeatedly trying to go against this distinction between rationality and emotionality. I think that most emotions are rational. They're rational in the sense that if you appraise the situation in a certain way, and rationally, you appraise the situation in a certain way, the rational conclusion would be to experience a certain emotion. You can say that anger is irrational, but I would say if I believe that you treated me unfairly, and if I believe that I don't deserve such behavior, and if I believe that I have the power or the control over the situation that can teach you a lesson, then feeling anger is definitely rational. Now, in the case of hatred, it's a little bit more complicated, and I'll try to explain why. Because again, I would say there are certain situations in which hate, even I would guess, David, according to your definition, is fully rational. Like, there are situations in the world in which certain individuals, psychopaths, or people with very, very, very extreme ideologies, really as part of their culture, as part of their very innate like values or beliefs, they want to destroy other people, other groups, other nations. In these situations, hate would be probably the most rational, or the only rational, emotional reaction to that situation. Why do I say that it's more complicated than that? Because I think that I would say, again, I'm just throwing a number, but in 95% of the cases, that's not the case. Like, in 95% of the cases, and this is where I think that it's irrational in a way, our interpretations of the reality or appraisals of others' behavior are biased. If we see one person among, or even a group of people among the outgroup who are trying to destroy us, the overgeneralization of jumping immediately to the conclusion of saying, these people represent the entire outgroup. This is them. Second thing is to say, again, that's not their behavior is driven by the innate cultural characteristics of the entire outgroup. All of these interpretations, in most cases, are biased. And in that sense, I would say that at least in the huge majority of the cases, hatred is irrational, or I would say, because I would say it's simply driven by biased interpretations of the reality.
So, as we said before, hate is omnipresent, and at some levels it's also normal and even welcome. And one of the theses that you promote in the book is that in Israel in recent years, the floodgates have opened, and that hate is no longer in a degree that is manageable or even potentially positive. Can you develop that and say, what really were the root causes for that in your view?
Okay, and that's basically I think that the question calls for an answer that is presenting the main thesis of the book, and I think that the main idea that I'm putting forward in the book is basically to say, first it relies on my understanding of social dynamics of hatred in democratic societies more broadly, even before I get to Israel. You should stop me if I'm getting too deep into the explanation, but I'll try to provide the 5 minutes version of this explanation.
The elevator pitch.
Yeah. No, it's a long it's a long ride in the elevator, but
upper high
I'll
rise,
try,
but yeah.
So my understanding and based on many years of research is that if you look at democratic societies around the world, you can think of it as if there are two forces that work against each other in each and every one of these societies. The first force is what I call the default dynamic of human societies. And I base it in the book on dozens and dozens of studies, but the basic argument is what I've said here before. And this argument is basically that if you take human beings in any place around the world, from any culture around the world, and you'll put them in a society without any normative or legal regulation, what you will get is an immediate move or constant move towards more and more tribalism, in-group favoritism, stereotyping, prejudice, and then also hatred. It's not because we're born hating or racist or whatever. It's because what I see as the normal and quite, I would say, even legitimate social dynamics that are leading us to this direction. And again, if I'll just very very briefly, I would say part of it is related to identity processes that I've described before. Part of it is related to the cognitive biases that we experience that are repeatedly misleading us in the way we interpret reality. Part of it is related to sense of threat and fear and competition between different groups. And when you take all of these processes together, that's the direction that groups and individuals are taking, as long as you're not stopping them or regulating them in any other way. So, and in that sense, I would say all societies are equal. I mean, if you take the American society or the North Korean society or the Israeli society, they will behave the same. Again, there are cultural differences, there are historical differences, but these are the more basic processes, basic social processes. Again, at least from my reading of research in social psychology, and to some extent also in sociology and political sciences. Against this process, what democratic societies do is that, they implicitly tell their people, we understand that. We understand that you have these needs, that you have, that automatically you tend to go towards this direction. But you know what? We want to be a democracy. We want to be different. And in order for us to be different, what democratic societies do, they signal some democratic norms of tolerance, respectful relations between groups, and equality to their audiences. They basically tell them, if you want to be a decent, acceptable individual within our society, you should know what's right and what's wrong. And we want to tell you what's right and what's wrong in terms of these, hate, extremism on the one side, and more tolerant and respectful and equal behavior on the other side. And that's what democratic societies do around the world. And if you look, comparatively on different societies, so definitely there are societies in which the levels of extremism and hatred are, much, much higher than in other societies. Then I would argue that the first mechanism, is more or less similar in all of them. And what differentiates, or what creates the variance between different societies is the second mechanism, is the question of, to what extent are these societies operating in order to create social norms that goes against hate, extremism, etc. And now I get back to your question about the Israeli society.
I think it writes itself, but go on. Yeah.
And then my answer, and again I'm describing it in many details in my book, in the last 2 decades, the Israeli society simply stopped to even try and create these social norms. And basically, I would say, I call it in the book, we abandoned the field. We abandon the field. We don't even try. When you look at the Israeli education system, when you look at the Israeli media, when you look at the Israeli politician and social leaders, when you look at the Israeli civil society, most of the Israeli civil society basically left the field. We didn't even try. And again, I would say in the last 2 decades, and the point in which maybe is a turning point is January 2023. And the eruption of the protest against the judicial reform. But until then, we stopped even trying to create and preserve norm of democracy, equality, tolerance, etc.
So that is to suggest that an erosion of democratic principles, values, and institutions is a prime condition for the flourishing of hate. Can we establish that general rule?
Yes, but I want to add one more point to that. Because if I only listen to the way you phrase the rule, so I would say so there are these crazy radicals or extremists who have huge influence on the government or on the society, and they try to or repeatedly try to damage the democratic values of the country, and this is what's leading to the dominant of hate. And I would say this is in a sense that's almost like a tautological kind of argument. There are these haters and extremists who became more dominant, and that's why these haters and extremists became more dominant. And I want to argue something a little bit more slightly different. I would say these haters and extremists they exist in all societies around the world. You can find these, the Israeli version of Ben Gvir, or the US or the European versions of Ben Gvir and Smotrich and others can be found in almost any society. And for me, and I think that's one of the main arguments of the book. For me, if we're asking ourselves who should be blamed for the fact that they became so dominant, so I put the spotlight mainly on the Israeli mainstream. And I think that the mainstream, the liberal democratic mainstream within each and every society is the one who actually determines what would be the actual, role or influence of the extremists within these societies. And my argument is that in the last 2 decades, the Israeli mainstream, the Israeli liberal democratic mainstream, not just Netanyahu or the people in the Likud, but the Israeli liberal democratic mainstream got confused. And in many, many ways, we've decided that we should be, the responsible adult of this society. And even though we're not the high power in terms of the dominance of our ideology, we still, perceived ourselves as the ones who should be responsible for, the shared society, the fact that we all will be together, the fact that we will be able, to live together here within that society. And as part of that process, we simply forgot, to put our values, ideologies, and norms on the table and to fight for our norms, values, and ideologies.
It's really interesting because what you're saying now really sheds light on a conundrum of Israeli politics in recent years, and that is putting October 7th aside for a second. But up until October 7th, Israel has enjoyed relatively peaceful period and prosperity. The Palestinians were rarely heard about or considered as either a partner or a threat or any player at all. And despite that, Israel has moved steadily to the right. So there's like this inverse correlation between the threat that the Palestinians posed and the way they were treated. And what you're saying, the dynamic that you described, really helps to explain that process. So my question here is hate divisible or indivisible in the sense that once you turn against an out group, it will come back to haunt you at some point? I mean, the internal divisions that we're now seeing in Israel, or have seen in parallel to the increasing hate against the out group, are they tied? Are they intertwined?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say that I think that one of the mistakes that we've been doing throughout the years is to believe that, by reducing the actual ideological disagreements here, we will be able to maintain a more peaceful internal society in terms of the internal Israeli society. And the idea that we only need to bring all of us together to focus on the things that we agree upon, and maybe to leave aside the things that we disagree upon. And to talk about in Israeli NGOs that talk about, let's focus on the 80% that we all agree upon, and put aside the 20% of disagreements. And I think that the rationale behind it was that if we will only focus on these 80% and put aside these disagreements, the 20% of the disagreements, then our society would have less hostility, less hatred, more cohesion, and we will be a more democratic and tolerant society. And in that sense, when you're talking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the occupation and all other things, these are things that are part of the 20% that we shouldn't talk about in order for us to maintain a more cohesive society. And I think that that's exactly where we were wrong. Because I think that what happened there was that as part of this, 20% that we didn't talk about was, legitimizing the racism and racist people here in Israel. As part of this 20% that we didn't talk about was legitimizing the continuation of the occupation, and not even discussing solutions, to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, basically saying, we can manage it, we don't have to deal with it, it's not urgent in any way. So we basically, met at the point in which the high power group in terms of ideology, and that's the right wing, or the more nationalistic, conservative people in Israel, they said, okay, we'll be happy to sit with you and talk about the 80%, because if we'll sit with you and talk only about the 80% that we agree upon, it basically means that we're going to maintain or preserve the current status quo. And the current status quo is basically saying, let's not delegitimize Ben Gvir. Let's not talk about occupation. Let's not talk about hate and extremism. And then it basically means that they can, maintain in the coalition and lead our country, because we simply do not challenge their ideologies.
So I want to take a step back and ask an historical question. I understand the logic of the claim that we see this intensification of hate over the last couple of decades, and certainly since the Second Intifada, the end of the Oslo peace process, which was such a triggering event for so many Israeli Jews. But the stigmatization of Palestinians, of Arab citizens of Israel, has been a leitmotif of Israeli society since the beginning of the state, since 1948. And democracy has been a very different proposition for Arab citizens of the state than it has been for Israeli Jews. A friend of mine sometimes reminds me that the golden age of Israeli democracy were the 6 months between the end of the military government in 1966 and the outbreak of the Six-Day War in June 1967. So my question is, isn't this deep and structural? Isn't it related to the role of the Palestinian other in a Jewish state? And isn't it also a function of the deep, profound trauma of the Holocaust as this powerful othering force in Israeli society, as opposed to a more recent phenomenon?
Okay, so I'll answer like an Israeli, and I'll say yes and no. Okay, and I'll say where I mean I partially agree with you, but I still think that the current situation is different. I'll say where I fully agree with you. I fully agree with you by saying that the historical collective trauma of the Israeli society, mainly the Jewish Israeli society, combined with the at least perceived existential threat and the continuous like violent conflict between Jews and Palestinians and the continuous occupation, they definitely created a society that in many ways is hate, at least towards some groups, would be considered as part of its identity, part of its like ethos or narrative, and the basic story of the Jewish Israeli society vis-a-vis the Palestinian society is a story that I wouldn't say that it's a hate story, but I would say that many parts of it are overlapping with the appraisals and other psychological components of hate. So in that sense, I fully agree with you, David. I would add to this another point, and I would say that I'm writing about it in the book. I always argued that hate is it's an emotion with no borders. It's almost like a diffuse kind of an emotion. So if you teach kids in high school or in elementary school that some groups are better than others, and in Israel it's in most cases Jews are better than Arabs or than Palestinians, then this question is in their minds when they consider all other, relations between different groups within their society. So they will ask themselves, so what do I think about ultra-Orthodox? Do ultra-Orthodox are inferior to secular? Do people with, I don't know, certain, whatever. But what I want to say is that when you legitimize hate towards one group, you basically legitimize hate towards all other groups as well. And in that sense, I would say that hate was dominant in the Israeli society, not just in regards to the Palestinians and Palestinian citizens of Israel, but also regarding other groups. But I do think that there is a change in the two last decades, and I would first define the change, and then I'll give you one example to demonstrate it. I think that the change is between very dominant or high levels of hate that were always here, since 1948 and the establishment of the Israel as an independent state, and hate was always here. By the way, not just towards Arabs, Mizrahim and Ashkenazim. I mean, I can talk about many different circles of hate, but hate was always here. What wasn't here is the normalization of hate and the fact that hate became legitimate and part of the mainstream of the Israeli society. And I'll demonstrate it, there's, very easily. Think about what Yitzhak Shamir, the former prime minister, did when, on the first time when Meir Kahana, the leader of the Kach movement, went to give a speech in the Israeli Knesset, in the Israeli parliament. The first time it happened, I think that it was on 1984, and Yitzhak Shamir, who was the leader of the main right-wing party, not a leftist. He took all the Knesset members of the Likud and most of the Knesset members of all other parties, with the exception of 5 or 4 Knesset members from Shas, and he called them to get out of the room. And he went out of this room and he said, "We will not sit in our Knesset when an explicit racist like Meir Kahana give a speech in our parliament." And he even gave an interview to the Israeli media, and he said, "I did that because I wanted to signal the Israeli public that these kind of people are not legitimate. We will not normalize these kind of people in our parliament." Now, fast forward, 39 years, And the leader of the same party, the leader of the Likud, it's not, the extremist or the radical rightist. That's the moderate, the party of the moderate right in Israel. He invites, Ben Gvir, who see himself as, the person who inherited like Kahana,
disciple,
of Kahana, and he invites him even before the elections, before he knows what would be, the actual power he will have in the Israeli parliament. He invites him before the elections and tells him, you will have a dominant part in my government. And actually, after the elections, he has a dominant part. Now, I'm giving this example because I think that that's exactly the contrast. I'm not saying that there wasn't racism towards Arabs in 1984 in Israel. It was dominant, it was intensive, it was there. But there's a difference between saying we know that there's hatred here. It's a problem. It's something we don't want to normalize, and we need to fight with all the tools. And that's what happened in 1984. Again, even though some people, felt that it's okay and experienced it, etc., versus what's happening today, in which, that's the norm. That's the norm.
So your prescription sounds top down, like what needs to be done to counter the spread of hate is leadership, is public discourse, things that are in the public domain. Are there any other things that are more on the grassroots level that can be done? In other words, what can be done to counter hate?
So I would say that the answer, first of all, the simple answer is definitely yes. There are many things that we can do in our daily routine, and definitely in our civil society movements and others in order to counter hate. And the main focus that I'm trying to put forward is the idea of signaling norms. And signaling norms against hate can be done, when you sit for lunch in your, in I don't know, in the university cafeteria, or wherever you go, and someone is saying, a racist statement, and you keep on the discussion. And everything, you don't want to be the party pooper, and you don't want to, and you're saying, I disagree, but I'm not going to fight with him right now on that statement. You're signaling a norm which basically says, racism and hate is fine. But if you stop the conversation and you say, I'm not going to be part of these kind of discussions, and if you won't apologize, I will have to move to another table. That's something that we can do in our daily life. I had the pleasure of sitting in many hiring committees in the university. In many of these hiring committees, you suddenly hear something, chauvinist or racist or something. The question
about a candidate,
and the question of what do you do in these kind of situations? What do you do when you sit, and watch television with your kids, and you see something on television? Do you respond immediately? What do we do? If when my kids go to school, and I get their, curriculum or their, textbooks or whatever, and I look into them, and I see that, the school is saying we teach values. And among these values, we don't see anything that's related to countering hate or racism. Do I approach school and say, do something about it? As a parent, I want this to be part of what my kids are learning at school. And definitely there are, more, I would say, political actions that we can do. We can demand from our politicians to draw a very, very clear line about the question of, who do we cooperate with? Who do we invite to meetings? Who do we sit with in committees or conferences or wherever? There are many, many different ways to signal norms. And I think that, we know how to do that in many other domains in our life, and we just have to do it more in that area as well.
So, Eran, I want to ask you a final big question, which is about October 7th. You write in the book that the manuscript was completed before October 7th, and then October 7th occurred. And you say, you talk in those introductory sections about how hate is dismantling Israeli society, and you also say that you didn't foresee that the internal disintegration of Israeli society would be fertile ground for the great tragedy that befell us. So Does hate help us explain what happened on that day?
Yeah, I'm happy that you mentioned that I said that I didn't forecast, of course, October 7th, but I did. You can be my, David, because you read the book before. I think that you read the book before October 7th, right?
Right. Yeah.
So you saw you saw and you read before October 7th that most of the interpretations or predictions about the Israeli society were there even before that. And my basic argument is that societies that normalize hate, societies that are dominated by hate, are in a way, dysfunctioning societies. And they're dysfunctioning societies for several reasons. The first and the most obvious one is that the different groups within the society simply cannot cooperate. And the fact that different groups within a society cannot cooperate is a huge, huge problem for a society. They can't cooperate, but they can also not, negotiate and discuss the main issues, which means that societies that are dominated by hate also, they can't make decisions. I don't think that it's a surprise that the Israeli society in the last 20 years simply don't make any decision. We don't decide about our borders. We don't decide about anything related to the conflict. We don't make decisions about the ultra-Orthodox and joining we don't make any decisions here simply because we're a dysfunctioning society. We cannot make decisions. The third point is that when you normalize hate and extremism, you get these crazy radicals and extremists leading your country. And what we see, and again, you can see it these days, you can oppose, you can disagree with Ben Gvir and Smotrich and others about their ideology, and that's one thing. But you can also look at them and say, they're simply incompetent to lead a country. And I think that that's what you get when you elect people who are radicals, who have these crazy ideologies and ideas in their minds, and they don't practically think about our, daily challenges. And when you combine all these things together, the fact that we can't make decisions, we cannot cooperate, our leaders are incompetent, we cannot, seriously discuss and get to agreements about major issues, that then you get a society that is much, much more susceptible to challenges and to internal and external challenges. And I think that in that sense, October 7th is not, of course, the intensity and the implications are dramatic, but it's not that of a surprise.
Can Israel be salvaged? I'm sure the answer is yes, but how soon do you see that happening, and what needs to be done?
And let me just add, how can the tools of social psychology help with a deeply damaged society?
So I think that the good news, at least from my perspective, and there aren't many good news here in the last year.
Though you do end on a somewhat optimistic note.
But the good news are that, I think that even before October 7th, the liberal democratic camp in Israel realized that in order for us to create a liberal democratic society that fight hatred and racism and extremism, we need to fight. And it's a struggle. And it's not, we can't just believe that we will, create this kind of shared society and shared narratives and talk all the time. It should be a struggle, and it's a struggle for social change. And I think that in the last 2 years, we've proven to ourselves and also to other people that we have a serious sense of agency and control over the situation, that we can actually influence the situation, that when we realize that, our values are important for us, many of us are willing to fight for our values. We managed to stop the attempts to create this judicial reform. And I think that with this momentum, and when we'll realize that it's not just to stop these attempts to change the Israeli society for the worse, we also need to create hope and to create, a vision of a different future for the Israeli society, and then to invest the same efforts of struggle in promoting this vision of different society. And I think that if we bring together the understanding that we must struggle and we must fight, and even if it will create some internal conflicts within the Israeli society, these conflicts are constructive in the sense that they can promote a better, more liberal, more democratic Israeli society. I think that we're now on a better or much better direction. Also, the fact that, we actually face our real problems, and we actually realize that we have to make decisions about our real problems. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a great example. If before October 7th, in our research in aChord, less than 15% of the Israeli society said, this is urgent, we need to deal with it, we need to find solutions to this conflict. Right now in our surveys, more than 70% are saying that it's urgent and that we need to find solutions. So Israel is, I believe, is entering a phase in which we will actually deal with our real problems. And I think that there's a huge camp who's really willing to fight and to deal and to put on the table our views and our values and our ideologies in the struggle to promote more liberal democratic society. In that sense, I'm slightly optimistic.
Only slightly. Professor Eran Halperin, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
And many thanks to you, David, as well to Itai Shelem, the manager of TLV1 Studios. And now we've got a request because most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app. And we would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has probably more than 1,000 interviews by now. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and most important, join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from us here in Tel Aviv, goodbye.